The screams echoing through the Parisian streets on that September morning weren't just cries of pain. They were the sound of humanity itself being torn apart, piece by bloody piece. What happened to one woman on September 3rd, 1792, would make even the most hardened executioners of revolutionary France turn away in horror. This wasn't just another political killing during the Reign of Terror. This was something far more sinister, far more calculated, and infinitely more brutal than any guillotine could deliver. Picture this: a mob of ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, and artisans who just hours before had been going about their daily lives, now transformed into something unrecognizable. They weren't just killing their victim, they were systematically destroying every shred of human dignity, every trace of the person she had once been. And the most chilling part, they were doing it with the methodical precision of people who believed they were saving their nation. The woman at the center of this nightmare was Princess Marie Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, known to history as the Princess de Lamballe. But before we dive into the unspeakable horror of her final hours, you need to understand who she was and why her death became the most psychologically devastating weapon the revolutionaries could wield against their ultimate target. Because this execution wasn't really about her at all. It was about breaking the spirit of someone else entirely, someone whose suffering would be far worse than any physical torture they could inflict. Think about the closest friendship in your life. The person who knows your deepest secrets, who's been there through your darkest moments, who would drop everything to help you without question. Now imagine watching that person being torn apart by a mob while you're powerless to help them. That's exactly what the revolutionaries were counting on when they decided the Princess de Lamballe's fate. Born into the prestigious House of Savoy in 1749, Marie Thérèse seemed destined for a life of privilege and comfort. At 17, she entered an arranged marriage with Louis-Alexandre de Bourbon, Prince de Lamballe, connecting her to one of France's wealthiest noble families. But privilege in the 18th century came with its own devastating costs. Her husband was notorious for his dissolute lifestyle, his gambling, his affairs, his complete disregard for the sensitive young woman he'd married. The marriage lasted barely a year before tragedy struck. In May 1768, the prince died suddenly, possibly from syphilis contracted through his reckless behavior. Marie Thérèse found herself widowed at 18, devastated and alone in a world that offered few options for women in her position. She could have remarried, could have retreated from court life, could have chosen safety and obscurity. Instead, she made a decision that would ultimately seal her fate. She chose to dedicate herself to service and friendship. This choice brought her into the orbit of another young woman struggling with isolation and the crushing expectations of royal life. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born Dauphine who had recently arrived at Versailles, was homesick, struggling to adapt to French customs, and desperately in need of genuine friendship in a court filled with intrigue and false flattery. The bond that formed between these two women was immediate and profound, built on shared experiences of loss, displacement, and the suffocating loneliness that could exist even in the grandest palaces. When Marie Antoinette became queen in 1774, she created a position specifically for her dear friend, appointing the Princess de Lamballe as superintendent of the household. This role came with significant influence and a generous annual salary of 150,000 livres, but it also painted a target on the princess's back that would grow larger and more dangerous with each passing year. The friendship between the queen and the princess wasn't just a casual court alliance. It was something approaching sisterhood, a deep emotional bond forged through shared joys and sorrows. The princess had been present for the births of the royal children, had served as confidant during the queen's struggles with her initially cold marriage, had provided unwavering support as criticism of the royal family mounted throughout the 1780s. She understood better than anyone the weight of the crown that Marie Antoinette carried, and she had made herself the Queen's emotional anchor in an increasingly hostile world. But this loyalty came at a price. As public resentment toward the royal family grew, the Princess de Lamballe became a lightning rod for criticism. Pamphlets and broadsheets began circulating, painting her as a corrupting foreign influence who encouraged the Queen's supposed extravagances. Her Austrian birth, her close relationship with Marie Antoinette, her position of influence at court, all of these made her a perfect target for revolutionary anger. The French Revolution erupted in 1789 like a powder keg that had been building pressure for decades. Years of financial crisis, social inequality, and political incompetence had created a perfect storm of resentment that would ultimately consume not just the monarchy, but anyone associated with it. For the Princess de Lamballe, who had spent her entire adult life within the protective walls of Versailles, the revolution represented an existential threat to everything she held dear. As the political situation deteriorated throughout 1790 and 1791, friends and advisors urged the princess to flee France while she still could. Her noble birth would protect her in the courts of Europe, they argued. She could find safety, could preserve her life, could wait out the revolutionary storm from a comfortable exile. But the princess faced a choice that revealed the true depth of her character. She could abandon her closest friend to save herself, or she could remain loyal even if it cost her everything. For a woman who had defined herself through service and devotion, there was really no choice at all. She understood the risks better than most. She had witnessed the revolutionary crowd's capacity for violence, had read the increasingly vicious attacks on the royal family in the revolutionary press. She knew her name appeared regularly on lists of enemies of the people, and she was aware that several noble friends had already been murdered by revolutionary mobs. Yet her sense of honor ran deeper than her fear of death. The princess's decision was also influenced by her deep religious faith, which taught her that earthly suffering was temporary, while honor and duty were eternal. She believed that abandoning Marie Antoinette in her hour of greatest need would be a betrayal of everything she stood for. Moreover, she recognized that her presence provided crucial emotional support to the Queen, who was struggling with the imprisonment of her family and the collapse of the world she had known. By the summer of 1792, the princess's fate was sealed. The radical Jacobins had gained control of the revolutionary government, and their rhetoric had turned increasingly violent toward all enemies of the Republic. The concept of mercy or moderation had been abandoned in favor of what they called revolutionary justice, a euphemism for the systematic elimination of anyone deemed a threat to the new order. The war that France had declared against Austria and Prussia only intensified revolutionary fervor and suspicion of anyone with aristocratic connections. The princess, with her foreign birth and royal associations, was seen as a potential traitor who might be working with France's enemies. Rumors and accusations swirled around her, making her position increasingly precarious with each passing day. On August 19, 1792, the Princess de Lamballe was arrested and taken to La Force prison, one of the most notorious detention facilities in revolutionary Paris. The prison was overcrowded, filthy, and dangerous, a far cry from the elegant apartments she had known at Versailles. Yet even in these degrading circumstances, she maintained her dignity and continued to express her loyalty to the royal family, refusing to denounce the monarchy, even when it might have saved her life. The conditions at La Force were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of political prisoners and extract confessions that could be used against their associates. The princess was crammed into a cell with common criminals, denied adequate food and sanitation, subjected to constant verbal abuse from guards who took pleasure in tormenting their aristocratic captive. The revolutionaries hoped these degrading conditions would force her to renounce her royalist beliefs and provide damaging testimony against Marie Antoinette. What they discovered instead was a woman whose faith and principles ran deeper than their capacity to break them. Despite the physical and psychological pressure, the Princess de Lamballe refused to compromise. She spent her days in prayer and meditation, drawing strength from her conviction that she was suffering for a just cause. Fellow prisoners later testified to her remarkable composure, noting how she shared what little food she had and provided comfort to other inmates struggling with their circumstances. The princess's steadfast refusal to cooperate only increased her captors' frustration and anger. Revolutionary officials had hoped to use her testimony to build a stronger case against Marie Antoinette. But her unwavering loyalty made her useless as a witness for the prosecution. Instead, she became something far more dangerous to them, a symbol of aristocratic defiance that needed to be crushed to demonstrate the power of the revolutionary government. As August turned to September, the atmosphere in Paris grew increasingly volatile. News that enemy armies were advancing on the capital, combined with rumors that imprisoned nobles and priests were planning to escape and join the invaders, created a perfect storm of paranoia and bloodlust. Radical leaders like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton whipped the population into a frenzy, convincing them that extraordinary measures were necessary to save the revolution from its enemies. The September Massacres began on September 2nd, 1792. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of popular anger, but organized campaigns of terror designed to eliminate enemies of the revolution and intimidate anyone who might oppose the new order. What followed was 5 days of systematic slaughter that claimed over 1,000 lives, transforming ordinary Parisians into instruments of unprecedented violence. The mobs that carried out these killings weren't composed of criminals or social outcasts. They were shopkeepers, artisans, laborers who had been convinced that their revolution was in mortal danger. They approached their grisly work with a sense of patriotic duty, believing they were saving France from traitors who deserved death. This transformation of neighbors into executioners was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the September Massacres. On September 3rd, the mob's attention turned to La Force prison, where word had spread that the Queen's closest friend was being held. The crowd had worked itself into a fury over her symbolic importance. She represented everything they hated about the old regime: foreign influence, aristocratic privilege, and unwavering loyalty to the monarchy they were trying to destroy. The princess was dragged from her cell and brought before a makeshift tribunal that had been set up in the prison courtyard. This wasn't a legal proceeding in any meaningful sense, but a piece of revolutionary theatre designed to provide a veneer of justice to what was essentially a lynching. The judges were members of the mob, drunk on power and bloodlust, who had already decided her fate before she appeared before them. The tribunal's questions were perfunctory and designed to trap rather than enlighten. They demanded that the princess swear an oath denouncing the monarchy and declaring her loyalty to the Republic. They wanted her to condemn Marie Antoinette as an enemy of the people and provide testimony that could be used in the Queen's eventual trial. Most importantly, they wanted her public submission, her acknowledgement that the old order was dead and the revolution had triumphed. The Princess de Lamballe's response was characteristic of the courage and dignity she had shown throughout her ordeal. She calmly but firmly refused to take any oath against the monarchy or say anything that might harm Marie Antoinette. She acknowledged that she could not swear loyalty to principles she did not believe in, and she expressed her willingness to accept whatever punishment the tribunal might impose. Her composure in the face of certain death impressed even some of her enemies. But the mob wanted more than just her death. They had expected her humiliation and submission, and her dignified defiance only enraged them further. Someone in the crowd shouted words that sealed her fate, and within moments, the princess was being dragged from the tribunal toward the prison gates. What happened next would shock even hardened revolutionaries, and remain one of the most horrifying examples of mob violence in human history. The princess was forced to run a gauntlet of attackers who beat her with clubs, stones, and whatever weapons they could find. But this was only the beginning of her ordeal. The mob's bloodlust demanded something far more savage than a quick death. They stripped her of her clothing and subjected her to sexual violence, their actions revealing the depths to which human beings could sink when all moral restraints were removed. The brutality was not incidental to their purpose, it was the purpose itself. They wanted to extract maximum terror and humiliation from her death, to demonstrate that no enemy of the people was beyond their reach. The manner of her killing defied every convention of civilized society, shocking observers across Europe and revealing how quickly civilization could collapse into barbarism. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic torture and mutilation that preceded her death. She was not simply killed, but deliberately brutalized in ways intended to deny her even the dignity of death. The mob's actions were calculated to send a message, not just to their immediate enemies, but to anyone who might consider opposing the revolution. They were demonstrating that loyalty to the old order would be met with consequences beyond imagination. What made the execution particularly horrifying was not just its brutality, but its calculated psychological impact. The revolutionaries knew that Marie Antoinette would learn of her friend's fate, and they wanted to ensure the Queen understood exactly what awaited anyone who remained loyal to the monarchy. The princess's death was intended as both revenge and warning, a demonstration of the revolution's power to destroy not just its enemies' lives, but their very humanity. But even death wasn't enough to satisfy the mob's thirst for degradation. In an act of unprecedented barbarity, they decapitated her corpse and mounted her head on a pike. Contemporary witnesses describe how the crowd then paraded through the streets of Paris, carrying the severed head like a trophy while chanting revolutionary songs and celebrating their victory over aristocratic tyranny. The mob's bloodlust was far from satisfied. They subjected her body to further mutilation, cutting it into pieces that were distributed among the crowd as grotesque souvenirs. Some accounts describe how her heart was torn from her chest and consumed by members of the mob, though these reports may represent the mythologizing that often surrounds particularly shocking historical events. What is certain is that her remains were treated with a savagery that horrified even contemporary observers who had grown accustomed to revolutionary violence. The severed head became the centerpiece of a grotesque procession that wound its way through Paris toward the Temple Tower, where Marie Antoinette was imprisoned. The mob wanted to ensure that the Queen saw what had become of her dearest friend, and they took deliberate steps to make the head recognizable despite the violence it had suffered. Witnesses described how they styled the princess's hair and applied cosmetics to create a horrifying parody of her former beauty. This procession was a carefully orchestrated piece of psychological warfare. The revolutionaries understood that physical torture alone was insufficient to break their enemies' spirits. They needed to destroy hope, love, and human connection itself. By forcing Marie Antoinette to confront the mutilated remains of her closest friend, they were attacking not just her body, but her soul, seeking to drive her to madness or despair. When the mob reached the Temple Tower, they demanded that the guards force Marie Antoinette to look out her window at the princess's severed head. The Queen initially refused, but the crowd's threats became so violent that she was eventually compelled to witness the horrifying spectacle. Contemporary accounts describe how she fainted upon seeing what had become of her friend, and how the sight haunted her for the remaining months of her life. The psychological impact of this forced viewing cannot be overstated. Marie Antoinette had already endured the loss of her throne, her freedom, and her way of life. But the sight of her friend's mutilated head represented a new level of cruelty that shattered whatever hope she might have retained. The revolutionaries had succeeded in their goal of breaking her spirit, demonstrating that they could reach her loved ones even in death and subject them to unimaginable degradation. The international reaction to the princess's execution was one of horror and revulsion. European courts, already alarmed by the revolution's excesses, saw in her death proof that France had descended into complete barbarism. The detailed accounts that circulated throughout Europe served to harden opinion against the revolutionary government and contributed to the formation of coalitions that would wage war against revolutionary France. Even within France, many moderate revolutionaries were shocked by the brutality of the September Massacres, and particularly by the treatment of the Princess de Lamballe. Her execution marked a turning point in the revolution, demonstrating that the radicals were willing to embrace any level of violence to achieve their goals. This realization would contribute to the factional struggles that would eventually consume many of the revolution's own leaders. The Princess de Lamballe's story challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and political extremism that remain disturbingly relevant today. Her execution serves as a stark reminder that civilization is fragile, that moral progress is not inevitable, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty when the right circumstances align. Yet her story also demonstrates the power of loyalty, courage, and human dignity to endure even in the face of unspeakable brutality. The Princess de Lamballe died as she had lived, faithful to her principles and devoted to those she loved. In an age that prized revolutionary virtue above all else, she chose personal loyalty over political correctness, friendship over safety, and honor over life itself. Her execution stands as one of the most shocking examples of mob violence in human history, but also as a testament to the human capacity for sacrifice and moral courage. Her death forces us to grapple with the tension between political justice and personal morality, between collective action and individual conscience. In choosing loyalty over survival, the princess affirmed values that transcend political movements and historical moments. The horror of what happened to Princess de Lamballe on that September day in 1792 should never be forgotten. Not because we should dwell on humanity's capacity for cruelty, but because we must remember the cost of abandoning our moral restraints and the preciousness of the civilization we too often take for granted. Her story is ultimately not just about the past, but about the eternal struggle between barbarism and civilization, hatred and love, fear and courage. In the end, while her execution reveals the depths to which people can sink when consumed by hatred and fear, it also demonstrates the heights to which individuals can rise when guided by love and loyalty. Her death was horrifying, but her life and the way she chose to end it remain inspirational, a reminder that even in history's darkest moments, the human spirit can shine with remarkable brilliance.